Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another live stream on History podcast, and today I'm joined by author Mark M. Mattison. And today we're discussing his new book, The Books of Jesus' Brother James. And in this book, he covers the Infancy Gospel of James, the Secret Book of James, the Letter of James, the First Revelation of James, and the Second Revelation of James. So it's good to have you back on the show, Mark. It's been a while.
Yes, well, thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
It's good to have you back. Thank you for joining me. Let's start with the Infancy Gospel of James. So it talks a bit about James from the infancy narrative view, and it tries to give us extra information about the historical James, his family, that we don't get from other books that talk about Jesus' brother James. So do you think there's, when you look at this text, when you worked on it, is there anything there that you would think is historically reliable that it tells us about James?
I think that there's not a lot in the Infancy Gospel of James that is that can reflect a lot of solid history in the early first century. Much of Infancy James is built off of the material in the Synoptic Gospels, especially Matthew and Luke, building upon the infancy narratives. Interestingly, there's little to no reference to the Gospel of John, and I've argued elsewhere that the Johannine allusions are subsequent redactions in the text, because I do believe that early 2nd century Assyrian dating is pretty certain. But in terms of Jesus's grandparents, Jesus's family, I don't think there's much by way of the Infancy Gospel of James that really tells us much about the history. If anything, many of the tropes that we find there and the descriptions of Jesus's grandparents and so forth, Anna and Jehoiakim, many of these narratives can be understood rather straightforwardly in terms of midrash, building on stories from the Torah and in the Tanakh about other characters like Hannah, for instance. So I think there's much that is informed in the Infancy Gospel of James by Hebrew scriptures and Jewish tradition.
When you look at the infancy narrative that it tries to give us, and it tells us information that we encounter in Matthew, but not just in Matthew, but also in Luke, does it seem to be combining details from Matthew and Luke's different infancy accounts together?
Yes, it does. There are the allusions are pretty straightforward when you work through the Infancy Gospel. I think it's pretty clear to see how interestingly the author ties those narratives together, and it adds additional information, and in some cases unique information, or information that may be a little bit different than what we find in Matthew and Luke.
Does it also pull information from other sources? Do we know anything about that, or does the author just concentrate on just embellishing what he encountered in the 4 canonical Gospels,
or 3 canonical Gospels, perhaps? As I mentioned, there certainly are references to the Hebrew scriptures, and off the top of my head, I know there's been some debate about some other pagan literature, but I think for the most part, the Infancy Gospel seems pretty steeped in the Jewish and Christian traditions.
And lastly, for that, when do you date the original publication of that book? Did you say early 2nd century earlier?
Yes, that's correct. I would say early 2nd century, and I would personally suggest that the author of the Infancy Gospel was not familiar with the Gospel of John. The Johannine allusions, I suspect, were built in between the 2nd century and the 4th century when the Bodmer Papyrus was composed.
All right. So can you tell us a bit about what the Secret Book of James is?
Certainly. This is a fascinating text, and I think not enough has been written about this text, which is why I'm particularly pleased about the commentary that my colleague Samuel Zinner has written about this text. We've also recently published, and I know you'll be speaking with him later on. But the secret gospel of the secret book of James, or otherwise known as the Apocryphon of James, is a text that was discovered in the corpus of the Nag Hammadi Library, which was discovered in 1945. It's the second tractate of the first codex, and it is an utterly fascinating text. It's clearly an esoteric text that builds on a lot of paradox and word plays. It's fascinating, and it opens with a rather remarkable scene describing Jesus's disciples sitting down, writing out their gospels, kind of pooling their memories, and piecing them together, which is an interesting way to think about gospel composition. And the setting is mainly a post-resurrection setting, with Jesus imparting knowledge to James and Peter in particular. And it's just overall a fascinating text. I encourage people to go through it and go through my new translation in this anthology as well.
Does it try to basically embellish the narrative of James about James's experience in regards to the post-resurrection of Jesus?
Well, stories about James's encounter with the post-resurrection Jesus are manifold. There's a reference in the gospel to the Hebrews that perhaps could be a precursor, or at least a congruent narrative. We also have post-resurrection appearances in the first and second revelations of James, where Jesus appears to James after his resurrection, and again imparts key important knowledge. So yes, there's definitely a development there, and it's pretty key to articulating the status of James as a leader in the early Jesus movement.
And when do you date the secret book of James?
I believe that my colleague Samuel has proposed a very plausible date during the Kaitos Rebellion of 115 to 1. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, about 115 to 117, give or take, but somewhere around that time, certainly early 2nd century is when I would date it, at a time when there were still evolving traditions about gospel development, and certainly the canon had not yet taken shape in the Christian church.
All right, so now we're talking about the Canonical Epistle of James. What do you make of the beginning when the author introduces himself as James, but he doesn't refer to himself as the brother of Jesus? Is he trying to say that my name happens to be James, but I'm really somebody else? What do you think is going on there?
I do think that the author is intended to be portrayed as the brother of Jesus, the leader of the Jerusalem church. I think that I know there's debate about whether the historical James actually composed the epistle, or whether it was composed posthumously in his name. And I personally lean toward the theory that it was written after the death of James, based on the elevated character of the Greek that the letter uses in part. But my inclination is to suspect that it was written in the late 1st century sometime. But it's fascinating the degree to which the content of James is reflected, or is congruent with some of the Jesus materials in the Gospel of Matthew, for example. So I think that's particularly noteworthy.
Could you expand on that? Because I know that other scholars have talked about double tradition overlaps between the letter of James and the Gospel of Matthew. In relations to the Q source. What's your thoughts on that?
I think those are very plausible descriptions. I know that James Tabor has made a lot of the relevance of Q and James and other literature as reflective of a particular strand of early early Christianity in the James tradition, the Jacobean tradition, and I think it's very plausible to point out the congruence between the Q material and the Jacobean material in the Epistle of James.
So do you think any of this letter of James goes back to the historical James, or do you think all of it postdates James?
I would not be surprised if there was material in the Epistle of James that would be reflective of what the James would have taught. That's certainly very plausible to me. I think in its current form, it certainly seems to be something that was composed later on with someone who had a different level of education than a first century artisan. But it would not surprise me at all, to posit that some of the material in canonical James does date back to James. It's interesting also the placement of this text in the canon, in the order that it's listed, with James, Peter, and John, in First and Second Peter and First, Second, and Third John, kind of reflective of the order in which Paul described his encounters with James, Peter, and John in the letter to the Galatians, for example, which I think strengthens the identification of this James with the James of tradition.
Yeah, that is a very good point. Does the letter portray James as strictly Torah observant?
I don't see any reason to think otherwise. The Epistle of James certainly has a very respectful and exalted view of the Torah, and it certainly seems to be very straightforward, in that respect. So I think that's pretty straightforward.
They date the text to the late first century. So how much later after James's death do you think this text was composed?
This is purely guesswork, and again, I would not stake it with absolute certainty that it was not written by James and it was written later in the first century. But it would not surprise me to think that it was written in the 80s or 90s. But again, there's no way of knowing for certain.
And what do you think about the letter of James in the context of literary relationship to Matthew? Do you think one knew the other, or do you think they're independent of one another? What's your thoughts on that?
My suspicion would be that the letter of James would have predated the Gospel of Matthew, especially if Matthew, written after Mark, written in at the turn of the century or the very early second century, and James in the later first century. I would think that James would have preceded Matthew. As far as Matthean knowledge of James, that's not a question that I've considered, but certainly there's a congruence, as you mentioned earlier. Provided one subscribes to the Q hypothesis of some congruence between Q and James.
This is kind of a side question to that. Do you believe in the Q source, or do you reject the Q source?
As we discussed in a prior interview, personally, I do subscribe to the Q hypothesis. I know that it is a matter of controversy nowadays, but personally, I find it to be a compelling hypothesis.
Yeah, that was just a brief recap question, in case the audience didn't see the previous interview.
Very good.
Yeah, now we're moving on to the first revelation of James. What is that text trying to do? Is it trying to make James be the spiritual brother of Jesus, or not so much? Like, what is that text trying to do with James now?
Well, that's a pretty broad question and a fascinating question also. The early statement within that text that Jesus is the spiritual brother of James, it's unclear whether it's by extension denying that James is also Jesus's physical brother, or whether it's simply emphasizing the fact that James is Jesus's spiritual brother, most importantly, even though he may also be a physical brother. And I think I reflected that in my translation by inserting the word just in parentheses in the text. But the one way or another, certainly the emphasis is on the fact that James, as Jesus's spiritual brother, is the most important aspect of James. And the text certainly has an exalted view of James as a leader of the early Jesus movement. I think it's trying to do a variety of things, honestly. Certainly addressing key issues that one finds in many religious literatures, dealing with the basic questions: who are we? Where did we come from? Where are we going? You know, especially in the context of the first revelation or the first apocalypse of James, you know, how are we to survive in this hostile imperial environment? You know, the Romans are and the rulers and the authorities are particularly hostile toward us. And how are we to seek the strength and the courage to live out our faith and seek to get by day by day? Those are key questions, and how to overcome the authorities and certainly the imperial rulers that are conflated with spiritual rulers as well, malevolent spiritual dynamics in the life of the community. So the epistle the apocalypse has a number of objectives, but dealing with persecution and martyrdom is certainly one of them.
And when it comes to the second apocalypse of James, it seems to go further and tries to name James's father as being Theuda, to make it seem even more clear that he is not Jesus's brother. What do you make of this Theuda that the second revelation of James introduces?
That also is a fascinating question, because obviously in Matthew and Luke, in the Synoptic Gospels, you know, we read about Joseph and Mary, and in the second apocalypse of James, we read of Theuda and Mary, or Theudas and Mary. And so how can that be reconciled with what we read about in the New Testament Gospels? There are a couple of possibilities. One possibility would be that we're expected to posit that Joseph had passed away at some point, and then subsequent to Joseph's death, Mary was remarried to Theudas, and then that Theuda was James's father, and therefore James would be a younger brother of Jesus. That's one possible reading. Another possible reading is that the author of the second apocalypse, or the second revelation of James, was not familiar with the tradition about Joseph, and understands, would have expected the reader to understand Theudas as being the father of both James and Jesus. In fact, in the text, Mary tells James, when Jesus appears in this post-resurrection context, Mary tells James, you know, that he is your brother. He was nourished by the same milk, and he is the brother from your father. So it is also possible that the second apocalypse of James doesn't even have room for the virgin birth. However, that particular text about Jesus being the brother from your father, there's a little bit of corruption of the manuscript at that point, so it's a little bit uncertain precisely what that's saying. But there are certainly perhaps more questions than answers about what the second apocalypse is suggesting about the relationship between James and Jesus.
If you have an opinion on that corrupt part of the text, what do you think it says? If you have a view on what you think it says at all on that.
Well, again, I wouldn't put down an interpretation with certainty, but it seems, I think, if I were to indicate where my inclinations lie, I think probably the most straightforward interpretation, you know, seeking the most simple solution of Occam's razor, might be that it's describing Theudas and Mary both as parents of Jesus and James. That would be my inclination, where I would think that where I would most likely come down. But again, I wouldn't state that with absolute certainty either, if that makes sense.
So in that case, if that reconstruction is correct, then it's not really trying to say that James isn't Jesus' brother then.
Oh, right. Yeah, if that interpretation is correct, it's simply saying that Jesus and James are, physical brothers. Yes, from both parents.
But from what's interestingly enough, a different father other than Joseph. It's Theuda instead.
Well, the implication would be that Joseph was not the father; that it was Theuda. Yes.
Very interesting. Hi, Fish and Ty. Thank you for your super chat. Opinion of the James ossuary.
Okay, that's a good question, and it's a question I haven't studied at any great length. But as far as I know, I think that is been described as not being authentic or authentically reflective of James. So I don't have a great deal to add about that, or I haven't studied that at any great length.
When do you date the first and second revelations of James?
I would also date those texts in the 2nd century, and the first revelation of James, I think, contains an intriguing passage that gives us even greater insight into that. The portion of the text that I've set off as chapter 12 describes a transmission history of the revelation, and it's rather detailed. It goes from Jesus through James to Addai, apostle to the east, to someone named Maniel or Masphel, and then to Levi, and then the younger of Levi's sons. And it's fascinating because that passage of text seems to give a great deal of attention to a detailed history of the Judean conflict with Rome, including not only the Jewish-Roman War of 66 to 70, but also the Kaitos Rebellion of 115 to 117, and leading all the way up to the Bar Kokhba Revolt of 132 to 135. And that's as far as the history goes. So it's plausible to imagine that the text was written shortly after the Bar Kokhba Revolt, or close to that time frame. It's also interesting that the younger son of Levi is the only character in this chain of transmission that is not named, perhaps implying that the community and the readers of the original text would have had a better idea of who this individual would have been.
Do you think that the second revelation of James, even naming James's father as someone completely different from either Joseph or Alphaeus, carries significance in the sense that there's disagreement in the early church about the parentage of the historical James?
I think there's very clearly a wide variety of opinions in the early church about the relationship of Jesus and James. And I think it's entirely driven by theological and Christological considerations. If Jesus were born of a virgin, then how would he have brothers and sisters, especially if Mary were to be perpetually a virgin? I think it's pretty well known that there are a number of interpretations about that relationship. There are certainly many sources, historical sources, that describe Jesus and James as brothers. And as far as the question as to how they were brothers, the obvious opinions would be, for one, that Jesus's siblings were older siblings and children of a prior marriage to Joseph, or that his sibling, and that's what we find in the Infancy Gospel of James, or that Jesus's siblings would have all been younger siblings born after the virginal conception and the birth of Jesus. But of course, in later Catholic tradition, that held to the perpetual virginity of Mary, the idea that Jesus could have had literal physical brothers and sisters was not accepted, by Jerome, which was what he really had against the infancy gospel of James. So were Jesus and James physical brothers? Were they spiritual brothers? What precisely was their relationship? We can clearly find many different opinions in the early church, and the Christian thinkers clearly went back and forth on that.
We got another super chat question from my fish in a tie. Thank you for your super chat. Opinion of James dying in 62 per Josephus.
I find that to be very plausible. Josephus's account seems straightforward, and it's also fascinating how Josephus's account is congruent to a certain extent with the account of James's death elsewhere. For example, in the Apocalypses of James and in the Clementine recognitions, the death account of James certainly is attested to by independent multiple attestation, both Christian and Jewish. So yes, I find Josephus's account to be very plausible.
So when you look at the differences between the first revelation and second revelation of James, and if your guess reconstruction earlier that you brought up is correct, that Theuda is intended to be the father of Jesus and James, if you had to reconstruct what that broken line was trying to say in the text. Is the second revelation of James in a sense responding against the first one, saying, I don't think it's a good idea to make James just a spiritual brother of Jesus?
I had not considered that the second apocalypse of James would be reacting to the first apocalypse of James. And while we're talking about that, I think it might be worth pointing out that we don't really know which of those texts was even written first, and the designations first and second apocalypse aren't even in the text. The texts don't say this is the first apocalypse, this is the second apocalypse. Those are designations placed on them by contemporary scholars based on the fact that these two texts appear side by side in, I believe it's Codex 5 of the Nag Hammadi Library, and both of them are labeled the Apocalypse of James in that codex. So the one that appears first is simply described as the first apocalypse of James, and the one that appears after it is described as the second apocalypse. But apart from that, we don't know what any relationship may have been. It is perhaps plausible that the scribe of Codex 5 placed them in that order because the second apocalypse of James has more emphasis on the martyrdom. So that would seem plausible. But as far as the relationship between the actual Greek texts themselves prior to this Egyptian translation, I don't think we know enough about it.
And then my final question, when you look at all these different books of James that we've got, does any of them, this is kind of a continuation of a similar question I asked earlier, like with the letter of James and the other books of James I was asking about earlier, if any of them have any historical kernel of truth about the historical James. So when you look at all of them, does each book contain kernels of truth about the historical James?
Yes, how much truth I think is uncertain, and I think there are varying degrees. For example, the Infancy Gospel of James doesn't contain very much information about James at all. But when we look at texts like the Apocryphon of James or the Secret Book of James, there are many passages in that text that seem very consistent with a very early Jesus tradition. In fact, Hedrick proposes that there are some actual historical sayings of Jesus that are not otherwise accounted for in the canonical Gospels that are to be found in the Apocryphon of James. Certainly, the emphasis on parables about the kingdom and the agricultural parables is very consistent with the the oral traditions we have of sayings of Jesus in the Gospels. The Epistle of James, as we've already discussed, certainly reflect very early Jesus traditions, including a congruence with the Sermon on the Mount, and the fact that the first and second apocalypses have some material corroborating what we read about in Josephus and the Clementine recognitions, I think is worth noting as well. So there are certainly kernels of truth in these sources and in other sources, church historians, Eusebius and so forth. Although I'm not certain how much of it is precisely historical, but there's a lot of congruence among these different sources. Yes.
Now, I just want to remind everybody real quick to go get the books of Jesus' brother James. The link to purchase the book is in the description below, and the History Valley Amazon affiliate link in the description below, and it will also be in the pinned comment. Oh, we do have one more super chat that made it in here. Hi, Fish and Tie again. Thank you for that super chat. Really appreciate it. Why were James and Simon written out of Christianity, Jesus' brothers?
I'm not sure that they were written out of Christianity. Certainly, in the Book of Acts, there is there's a portrayal of James as rising to be indisputably the leader of the Jerusalem church. Certainly, by the time we run into chapter 15, and then again in later on in the text. So I'm not sure that they were written out of Christianity. I don't know if the questioner is asking about what. I'm uncertain what else the question is getting at, but yeah, James is certainly recognized as an important leader, not only in the New Testament, but also among Eusebius and other sources in Clement as well. So.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Mark Mattison.
Thank you.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron. And or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.